What happens when one of Britain's most respected actors comes face to face with television's most controversial panel? You won't believe what unfolds when Sir Ian McKellen sits down with Denise Welch and the Loose Women crew in what starts as a pleasant chat about his legendary career, but quickly descends into absolute chaos. This isn't just another celebrity interview gone wrong. This is a masterclass in how to destroy decades of goodwill in under 20 minutes of live television. Before we get into this incredible story, make sure you hit that subscribe button and drop a comment below, because you're not going to believe what unfolds when these worlds collide in the most spectacular fashion. Last night's episode of Loose Women began innocently enough. The 84-year-old theatrical legend appeared via video link from his London home, promoting his upcoming memoir and what was supposed to be a career retrospective. The panel, Denise Welch, Nadia Sawalha, Kay Adams, and Janet Street Porter, NIE, seemed thrilled to have such a distinguished guest. McKellen, impeccably dressed in a navy blazer and looking every inch the consummate professional, smiled warmly as Denise introduced him with her usual theatrical flourish. "We're absolutely delighted to have Sir Ian McKellen with us today," Denise beamed, her voice dripping with the kind of reverence usually reserved for royalty. "Your career spans over 6 decades. You've played everything from Gandalf to King Lear, and you've been a trailblazer for LGBTQ+ rights long before it was fashionable. We're genuinely honored to have you." McKellen's response was gracious, if slightly formal. "Thank you, Denise. It's always a pleasure to speak with you and the panel. Though I must say, I've watched your show occasionally, and I'm not entirely sure what to expect." There was something in his tone, a subtle wariness that suggested he'd done his homework about the show's reputation for stirring controversy. The panel exchanged glances, and you could almost see the gears turning in Denise's head. The first few minutes proceeded smoothly. They discussed his early days at Cambridge, his breakthrough roles with the Royal Shakespeare Company, and his decision to come out publicly in 1988. McKellen spoke eloquently about the challenges of being a gay actor in an industry that demanded silence about one's personal life. His voice carried the weight of experience, each word carefully chosen and delivered with the precision that had made him one of Britain's finest actors. It wasn't easy, he reflected, his eyes distant as he recalled those early years. The theater was more accepting than film and television, but even then, there were producers who made it clear that certain roles weren't available to openly gay actors. The irony, of course, was that many of the most powerful people making these decisions were themselves gay, but living in fear. Janet Street Porter nodded sympathetically, but there was something calculating in her expression. That must have been incredibly frustrating, especially when you were watching less talented actors get parts simply because they were straight, or at least pretending to be. McKellen's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "I wouldn't say less talented, Janet. That's not how the industry works. But yes, there were certainly times when authenticity came at a professional cost." "But surely," Denise interjected, leaning forward with that predatory smile she reserves for moments when she senses blood in the water, "you must have some regrets about how you handled things. I mean, coming out in 1988 wasn't exactly courageous by today's standards, was it?" The temperature in the studio seemed to drop several degrees. McKellen's eyebrows raised slightly, and for a moment, the mask of professional courtesy slipped. "I'm sorry. Could you clarify what you mean by that?" Denise's smile widened, and the other panelists shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Even they seemed to sense that she was venturing into dangerous territory. "Well, I'm just saying, 1988 was hardly the Dark Ages, was it? Rock Hudson had already died of AIDS-related complications. George Michael was practically screaming his sexuality from the rooftops, and yet you waited until you were nearly 50 to be honest about who you were. Some might say that's a bit calculated." McKellen's composure was legendary, honed through decades of dealing with difficult directors, hostile critics, and the occasional unhinged fan. But something in Denise's tone, the casual cruelty disguised as journalistic inquiry, seemed to strike a nerve. His fingers tightened on the arms of his chair, and when he spoke, his voice had acquired an edge that anyone familiar with his portrayal of Magneto would recognize. "Calculated?" he repeated, his tone deceptively calm. "I think you might want to consider the historical context before making such sweeping judgments, Denise. In 1988, Section 28 had just been enacted. Homosexuality was still illegal in Scotland and Northern Ireland, and the AIDS crisis was being weaponized by politicians and tabloids to justify the most vicious homophobia this country had seen in decades. Nadia Sawalha tried to interject with a conciliatory comment about different generations facing different challenges, but Denise was clearly in one of her moods, the kind that had made her infamous for reducing guests to tears or walking off in disgust. "Oh, come on, Ian," she said, using his first name with the kind of forced familiarity that suggested she considered herself an equal. "You were already established. You had money. You had protection. What about all those young gay actors who were struggling while you were playing it safe in the closet?" The silence that followed was deafening. McKellen's face had gone completely still, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried the kind of quiet fury that seasoned actors know is far more terrifying than any amount of shouting. "Playing it safe?" he said, each word dropping like a stone into still water. "Do you have any idea what you're talking about? Or are you simply trying to manufacture controversy for your ratings?" Denise's eyes lit up. She'd found her target, and she wasn't about to let go. But what happened next would prove that she'd picked the wrong person to try to humiliate on live television. The veteran actor leaned back in his chair, and for a moment, the camera caught something in his expression that would have made Sauron himself think twice. When McKellen spoke again, his voice had acquired the kind of theatrical authority that could silence a restless West End audience from the back row of the stalls. "Denise," he said, her name rolling off his tongue with the same disdain he might reserve for a particularly incompetent understudy. "I've spent the better part of my career dealing with directors who mistake cruelty for insight, critics who confuse provocation with intelligence, and journalists who think that tearing down others somehow elevates their own standing. But rarely have I encountered someone who manages to embody all three failings quite so comprehensively." The panel sat in stunned silence. Kay Adams looked like she wanted to disappear into her chair, while Janet Street Porter's mouth had fallen open in a most undignified manner. Even Nadia, usually quick with a diplomatic intervention, seemed frozen by the sheer force of McKellen's response. But Denise, to her credit or detriment depending on your perspective, wasn't backing down. If anything, his pushback seemed to energize her further. "Oh, so now we're attacking the messenger instead of addressing the message? That's very mature, Ian. Very brave." "Brave?" McKellen's eyebrows shot up, and suddenly the temperature in the studio seemed to plummet another 10 degrees. "You want to talk about bravery? Let me tell you about bravery, since you seem so keen to lecture me on the subject." What followed was a masterclass in controlled fury. McKellen's voice never rose above conversational level, but every word was delivered with surgical precision, each sentence building inexorably toward a devastating climax. "In 1988, when I came out on that radio program, I received over 3,000 letters. Do you know what was in those letters, Denise? Death threats. Graphic descriptions of what certain people wanted to do to me. Photos of mutilated bodies with my face pasted on them. I had to hire security. I had to change my phone number. I lost roles. Yes, even in 1988, even as established as I was, I lost work." Denise tried to interrupt, but McKellen held up a hand with the kind of authority that brooked no opposition. "But more importantly," he continued, "I received over 2,000 letters from young people, teenagers mostly, telling me that hearing someone like me speak openly about being gay had literally saved their lives. Boys who had been planning suicide, girls who had been thrown out of their homes, young actors who thought they could never have a career and be authentic about who they were." The studio had gone completely silent. Even the camera operator seemed to have stopped breathing. McKellen's eyes never left Denise's face, and when he spoke again, his voice carried the weight of decades of experience and pain. "So when you sit there in your comfortable studio, with your platform and your security and your righteous indignation, and suggest that my coming out was somehow insufficient or calculated, you're not just insulting me. You're insulting every single person who found the courage to live authentically because they heard someone else do it first." For the first time since the interview began, Denise seemed genuinely rattled. Her usual confident smirk had been replaced by something approaching uncertainty. But instead of gracefully retreating, She doubled down in the way that only truly desperate television personalities do. "Look, I'm sorry if I've touched a nerve," she said, though her tone suggested she wasn't sorry at all. "But surely, as public figures, we have to be willing to examine our choices critically. I mean, you've made millions playing Gandalf and Magneto, characters that children adore. Don't you think you have some responsibility to those young fans?" McKellen's face went completely still. The other panelists looked genuinely alarmed now. Even they could see that Denise had just crossed a line that should never be crossed. Responsibility to children? McKellen's voice was barely above a whisper, but somehow it seemed to fill the entire studio. "What exactly are you suggesting, Denise?" "I'm just saying," Denise pressed on, seemingly oblivious to the warning signs that everyone else in the studio could clearly see. "When you're playing beloved characters in family films, maybe there's an argument that your personal life should be discreet." The silence that followed was the kind that usually precedes natural disasters. McKellen stared at her for a long moment, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried a coldness that could have frozen the Thames. "Discreet, I see. And tell me, Denise, should straight actors also keep their personal lives discreet? Should Harrison Ford have hidden his marriages? Should Emma Watson never speak about dating? Or is this special burden of invisibility reserved exclusively for actors who happen to be gay?" Denise realized she was in trouble, but instead of backing down, she made the fatal mistake of trying to justify her position. "That's not what I meant, and you know it. I'm just saying that when children are involved..." "When children are involved, what?" McKellen cut her off, and now there was real anger in his voice. "When children are involved, they deserve to see that people like me exist? That we're not monsters or predators, or whatever poisonous stereotype you're dancing around? That we can be heroes and wizards and grandfathers and teachers and anything else we choose to be?" The confrontation was reaching a boiling point, and everyone in the studio could feel it. McKellen was no longer the gracious guest promoting his memoir. He was a man who had spent decades fighting for dignity and recognition, and he wasn't about to let some afternoon television host tear down everything he'd worked for. "You know what the real tragedy is here, Denise?" McKellen continued, his voice rising for the first time in the interview. "It's that you think you're being progressive. You think you're asking the tough questions, holding people accountable, but what you're actually doing is perpetuating the same bigoted nonsense that kept people like me in the shadows for decades." Denise's face had gone red, and not with embarrassment. "Now hold on just a minute." "No, you hold on," McKellen snapped, and suddenly the polite, diplomatic actor was gone, replaced by someone who looked ready for war. "I've listened to your questions. I've tried to give you thoughtful answers, and in return, you've questioned my courage, my integrity. And now you're suggesting that my very existence is somehow inappropriate for children to witness. Well, I've had quite enough of this." The tension in the studio was so thick you could cut it with a knife, and everyone watching could sense that something explosive was about to happen. McKellen stood up from his chair, a simple gesture that somehow felt monumentally significant. The camera angle shifted to capture his full frame as he straightened to his impressive height, every inch the commanding presence that had dominated stages across the globe for over 6 decades. "You want to know what I think, Denise?" he said, his voice now carrying the full weight of his theatrical training. "I think you've spent so long manufacturing outrage for entertainment that you've forgotten there are actual human beings on the receiving end of your provocations." Denise, sensing that she was losing control of the situation but unable to stop herself, made one final, catastrophic attempt to regain the upper hand. "Oh, please, don't try to play the victim here, Ian. You're a wealthy, successful actor with a knighthood. You hardly need protection from a few hard questions." The effect of those words was immediate and devastating. McKellen's face went through a series of expressions: disbelief, disgust, and finally, a kind of weary resignation that was somehow more damning than any amount of anger could have been. "A few hard questions," he repeated slowly, as if tasting something particularly unpalatable. "Is that what you call suggesting that gay actors should hide their sexuality to protect children? Is that what you call implying that my coming out was somehow cowardly or calculated? Is that what you call questioning whether someone like me should be allowed near family entertainment?" The other panelists had gone completely silent. Kay Adams was staring at her hands, clearly wishing she were anywhere else. Janet Street Porter looked genuinely ashamed, and even Nadia Sawala, usually the voice of reason, seemed at a loss for words. "Now you're twisting my words," Denise protested, but her voice lacked its earlier conviction. Even she seemed to realize that she'd pushed things too far. "Am I?" McKellen asked, tilting his head with a kind of theatrical timing that had made him a legend. "Let me ask you something, Denise. When you were preparing for this interview, did you genuinely believe that questioning my integrity and suggesting that my existence is inappropriate for children would make for compelling television? Or were you simply so desperate for viral moments that you didn't care who you hurt in the process?" The question hung in the air like a sword over Denise's head. For the first time in the entire interview, she seemed genuinely speechless. McKellen didn't wait for an answer. "Because here's what I see," he continued, his voice growing stronger with each word. "I see a woman who has built her career on controversy, who mistakes cruelty for honesty, and who seems to believe that tearing down others is somehow a form of journalism. I see someone who has become so addicted to outrage that she's lost sight of basic human decency." McKellen moved closer to the camera, his eyes boring directly into the lens, as if he were speaking to every viewer individually. "And I see someone who, in her desperation to create drama, has just spent the last 20 minutes demonstrating exactly why so many young LGBTQ+ people still feel unsafe, unwelcome, and unworthy of basic respect." Denise tried one last time to salvage the situation. "Ian, I think you're overreacting." "Overreacting?" McKellen's laugh was sharp and humorless. "Denise, in the space of one interview, you've managed to question my courage, my integrity, my suitability for family entertainment, and my right to exist authentically in public spaces. If that doesn't warrant a strong reaction, I don't know what does." He paused, looking directly at Denise with an expression that mixed pity with contempt. "You know what the saddest part is? You probably think you've done something brave here today. You probably think you've asked the tough questions, held a powerful man accountable. But what you've actually done is demonstrate that even in 2025, even on daytime television, even with a Knight of the Realm, the same tired prejudices and dog whistles still find their way into the conversation." The studio was dead silent, except for the low hum of the cameras. McKellen took a step back from his desk, his movements deliberate and final. "I came here today to talk about my memoir, to share some stories from a long career, maybe to inspire a few young people who are struggling with their identity. Instead, I've been subjected to what can only be described as a masterclass in how not to conduct an interview." He looked directly at Denise one final time. "I hope you're proud of yourself." Denise, her face now pale and her earlier confidence completely evaporated, made one last desperate attempt to keep him on the show. "Ian, please, I think there's been a misunderstanding." "No misunderstanding," McKellen said firmly, reaching toward his computer. "I understand perfectly. You wanted a show, Denise. You wanted drama and controversy and something to clip for social media. Well, congratulations. You got it." He leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping to the kind of whisper that somehow carried more authority than any shout. "But let me leave you with this thought. When you go home tonight and think about what happened here, ask yourself this question. Was it worth it? Was humiliating an 84-year-old man who has spent his entire career fighting for dignity and equality worth whatever boost in ratings you think this might bring?" The camera caught the exact moment when McKellen's hand moved toward his laptop. "Because I can tell you right now, this is the last time I'll ever dignify this show with my presence. And I suspect I won't be alone in that decision." Denise made one final, pathetic attempt to stop him. "Ian, wait, please." But Sir Ian McKellen had heard enough. With the same dignity and grace that had characterized every performance of his legendary career, he looked directly into the camera one last time. "To anyone watching who might be struggling with their identity, who might be wondering if they'll ever be accepted for who they are, let me say this. You are worthy of respect. You are worthy of love. You are worthy of taking up space in this world. And anyone who suggests otherwise is not worth your time or your tears." And with that, the screen went black. Sir Ian McKellen had disconnected from the call, leaving behind a studio full of stunned panelists, a host who had finally been put in her place, and millions of viewers who had just witnessed one of the most devastating takedowns in television history. The silence that followed seemed to stretch on forever, broken only by the sound of Denise Welch clearing her throat and muttering something about technical difficulties. But everyone watching knew exactly what had happened. One of Britain's most respected actors had just walked away from one of its most controversial talk shows, and he had done it with a dignity and eloquence that made Denise Welch's behavior look even more petty and mean-spirited by comparison. It was, without question, television gold. But it was also something more than that. It was a reminder that some people, no matter how famous or successful or comfortable they might appear, still deserve to be treated with basic human decency. And when they're not, sometimes they have the courage to simply walk away.